At my father's funeral, my brother took everything. I remember thinking as I stood there in the back pew, watching strangers shake his hand like he was the one who had been there every night, like he was the one who had held our father's hand when the pain got too heavy for words, and I said nothing, not because I agreed, but because something inside me had already gone quiet long before that moment, the kind of quiet that comes when you realize you're no longer part of the story everyone else is telling. The church smelled faintly of polished wood and old hymn books, the kind my father used to keep stacked neatly in the living room, and for a moment I could almost hear his voice correcting the way I used to sing as a child, soft and patient, never raising his tone, always believing that if he gave something enough time, it would find its way into place. And maybe that was why he believed in us, in both of us. Even when only one of us stayed, I wore the navy dress he had once said made me look steady. Not pretty, not young, but steady, like someone you could rely on. And I suppose that was what I had become in the last 6 years of his life, the one who stayed when staying stopped being easy, the one who learned the names of his medications, who measured out teaspoons of syrup at 2 a.m., who listened when the nights stretched too long and his memories started to wander into places he couldn't find his way back from. Richard stood at the front near the casket, his hand resting lightly on the polished wood as if proximity alone could rewrite history, his black suit tailored, his expression carefully arranged somewhere between grief and authority, and beside him Evelyn leaned in close, whispering something that made him nod just slightly, the kind of nod that meant a decision had already been made before anyone else even knew there was one to be made. People came up to him, one after another, offering condolences, shaking his hand, telling him what a good son he was, and each time he accepted it without hesitation, without correction, without even a glance in my direction, and I realized then that absence doesn't need to be loud to be complete. Sometimes it's just the space where someone should have been acknowledged but wasn't. After the service, when the last hymn faded and the pastor closed his book, the crowd began to drift toward the exit, slow and quiet, like a tide pulling back, and that was when Richard turned, not to me, but to the small cluster of relatives still lingering near the front, and he said, "I'll take care of everything from here." His voice calm, practiced, final, and no one questioned it, not even me, because by then I understood that this wasn't a conversation, it was an announcement. Evelyn's eyes found mine just for a second, and there was something in them that didn't belong in a place like that, not grief, not even indifference, but something sharper, something that suggested this moment had been anticipated, prepared for, maybe even timed, and she gave me a small, almost polite smile before turning back to the others as if I had already been dismissed from the room. We drove to the house. Afterward, the same house where I had spent the last 6 winters measuring time by the sound of the furnace turning on and off, by the creak of the hallway floor outside my father's bedroom, by the rhythm of routines that had slowly become my life. And as I stepped out of my car, I noticed Richard already at the door, keys in hand, moving with a kind of confidence that didn't match the weight of the day. And for a brief moment I thought he might turn, might say something, might acknowledge that this place held more than just walls and furniture for me, but he didn't. Inside, the living room was still exactly as I had left it that morning, the blanket folded over the arm of the chair, the reading glasses on the side table, the faint imprint of my father's presence lingering in the quiet, and I stood there just long enough to feel it, to let it settle, before Richard's voice cut through the stillness again, telling me we would sort things out later. That it was simpler this way. And I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I had learned that sometimes silence is the only thing people can't use against you. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I didn't remind him who had been there and who hadn't, because something deeper had already shifted inside me, something that didn't need his acknowledgement to be real. And as I walked past him toward the hallway, toward the room where my father had spent his final days, I realized that whatever Richard thought he had just taken, it wasn't the whole story, not even close, but I let him believe it was. Because sometimes the most important truths are the ones you don't reveal right away. I did not stay long in the house that afternoon, not because I wanted to leave, but because I could already feel the shift in the air, the subtle but undeniable way a place changes when the people inside it decide you no longer belong there. and as I stepped back out onto the front porch, I glanced once at the oak tree my father had planted the year I turned 10, its branches stretching wide across the yard like they always had. Steady and unchanged, and for a moment I wondered how something rooted so deeply could remain untouched while everything else seemed to move so quickly toward erasing what had been. I drove back to the small apartment I had rented during those last months when my father needed more care than the house could comfortably hold, and as I unlocked the door, the quiet inside greeted me in a way that felt both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Like a space that had been waiting but did not quite know what to do with my return, and I set my keys down on the narrow kitchen counter, noticing how light they felt without the extra weight of the house key I had carried for so many years, a small detail, but one that seemed to say more than anything Richard had spoken out loud. The next morning came with the kind of pale winter light that makes everything look a little softer than it really is, and I found myself waking up before the alarm, out of habit more than necessity, reaching for a routine that no longer belonged to me, and for a few seconds I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the familiar sound of my father calling from the other room, but there was nothing, only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic beyond the window, and it was in that stillness that I realized how much of my life had quietly revolved around someone else's needs, how completely I had stepped into that role without ever questioning what would remain when it was over. I made coffee the same way I always had, measuring it carefully, letting it brew just long enough, and I poured it into the same ceramic mug I had used every morning at the house. The one with the small crack near the handle that my father used to joke about, saying it had more character that way. And I sat at the small table by the window, looking out at a view that had never quite felt like mine, and I thought about the years leading up to this moment, the quiet accumulation of choices that had seemed so simple at the time, staying when it would have been easier to leave, saying yes when no might have protected me, believing that effort and care would naturally find their way back to me in some form. Richard had not been absent in the way people usually think of absence. He called on holidays, he sent gifts that arrived in neatly wrapped boxes, he spoke in a voice that carried just enough concern to satisfy anyone listening, but he had never stayed long enough to see what staying actually required, and I had told myself that it did not matter, that family was not a ledger to be balanced, that love did not need to be measured, and maybe that had been true once. But sitting there with my coffee growing cold, I began to understand that there is a difference between giving freely and being quietly overlooked, and it is not always easy to see where one ends and the other begins. Over the next few days, small things began to surface in ways that did not feel like coincidences, the kind of details that do not demand attention at first but linger just long enough to create a question you cannot quite ignore. A neighbor from my father's street stopped me at the grocery store and mentioned seeing Richard at the house late one evening a week before the funeral, carrying boxes out to his car, and I smiled politely, thanked her for telling me, and walked away without asking more, not because I was not curious, but because I had learned that questions asked too soon often lead to answers that are carefully prepared. Later that afternoon, as I sorted through a stack of mail that had been forwarded to my apartment, I noticed a letter from the bank addressed to my father but marked with a note requesting immediate attention, and I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of something I could not yet name, before setting it aside, telling myself there would be time to look at it later, that there was no need to rush into anything when everything important had already been taken, or at least that was what it appeared to be, and still, beneath that thought, something quieter persisted, a sense that the story was not as complete as it seemed, that there were pieces I had not yet seen, and as I sat there in the fading afternoon light, the room growing dim around me, I realized that for the first time since the funeral, I was not just remembering what had been lost, I was beginning to notice what did not quite add up, and that shift, small as it was, felt like the beginning of something I had not expected, something that required patience, something that would not reveal itself all at once, but piece by piece, in the spaces between what had been said and what had been carefully left unsaid. The letter from the bank stayed on the corner of my table for 2 days before I finally opened it, not because I was avoiding it, but because I had learned that some things reveal themselves more clearly when you are ready to see them without rushing, and when I did slide my finger carefully under the envelope and unfold the paper inside, I noticed right away that it was not written in the usual tone of routine correspondence. There was a formality to it, a precision in the language that suggested something more deliberate, and as I read through the lines I realized it was not a request, but a confirmation, a reminder about a safety deposit box registered under my father's name with authorized access granted to me, and for a moment I simply sat there, holding the paper in both hands, letting the meaning settle in slowly, because in all the years I had managed his appointments, his medications, his bills, he had never once mentioned anything about a deposit box, and yet here it was, existing quietly in the background, untouched by everything that had just happened. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table, then stood up and moved toward the window, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the buildings outside. And I thought about how many times I had assumed that everything important in my father's life had been visible to me, that nothing significant had been kept out of reach, and now, for the first time, I began to consider that there might have been parts of his planning that he had kept deliberately separate, not out of secrecy, but out of intention. The next morning I dressed slowly, choosing a simple gray coat and the same low heels I had worn for years because they were comfortable and steady, and I drove to the bank just after it opened. The air still cold enough to fog the edges of the windshield, and as I parked in the nearly empty lot I noticed how ordinary everything looked, how unchanged the world seemed despite the shift that had taken place in my own life, and I stepped out of the car, closing the door with a soft, measured movement, as if any sudden action might disturb the quiet clarity that had begun to form. Inside, the bank smelled faintly of paper and polished counters, and a young teller greeted me with a polite smile, asking how she could help. And I handed her the letter without explanation, watching as her expression shifted slightly into something more attentive, more careful, and she nodded before asking me to wait, disappearing into a back office for a few minutes that felt longer than they should have, not because of impatience, but because of the weight of possibility that had begun to build. When she returned, she was accompanied by a manager, a woman in her late 50s with a calm presence and a voice that carried quiet authority. And she introduced herself as Linda Carter, explaining that she would assist me with accessing the box, and there was something in the way she spoke, a subtle acknowledgement, as if she understood that this was not just a routine visit, but something that mattered. She led me down a narrow hallway to a secured door, unlocking it with practiced ease, and the room beyond was lined with small metal compartments, each one holding its own quiet story. And as she located the number corresponding to my father's account, I felt a brief, unexpected hesitation, not out of fear, but out of respect, as though opening that box would bring me closer to something I had not yet fully understood. The key turned smoothly, and she stepped back to give me privacy, placing the small metal container in my hands before moving toward the door, and for a moment I simply stood there, holding it, aware that whatever was inside had been placed there with intention, that my father had made a choice about what to keep separate from everything else, and slowly, carefully, I opened it. Inside, there were no stacks of cash, no obvious valuables, just a neatly arranged set of documents. A small envelope with my name written in my father's handwriting, and a photograph tucked beneath it. And as I lifted the envelope first, tracing the familiar curve of the letters, I felt something steady settle inside me, a quiet understanding that whatever had been taken from me at the house had not been the whole of what my father had left behind, and that realization did not come with anger or urgency, but with a calm clarity that felt stronger than either. And as I opened the envelope and began to read the words inside, I knew, without needing to see anything further, that the story I had been given was incomplete, and that the part one was about to uncover would change everything that had come before it. The paper in my hands did not tremble, but something inside me did, not from fear, but from recognition, the kind that arrives quietly when a truth finally steps into the light after waiting patiently to be seen. And as I read my father's words, written in the same careful script he had used for years, I could almost hear his voice again, steady and unhurried, explaining something he had already thought through long before I realized there was anything to explain. He began simply, addressing me the way he always had when something mattered, not with affection that needed to be declared, but with a clarity that assumed I would understand, and he wrote that if I was reading this, it meant certain things had already happened, that decisions had been made in my absence or without my consent, and that he trusted I would recognize them for what they were, not immediately, but eventually, because understanding, he believed, was not something that could be forced, it had to unfold at its own pace. He went on to explain that in the last year of his life, he had become aware of changes in behavior, not mine, but Richard's, subtle at first, small questions about documents, repeated mentions of ownership, a growing interest in details that had never concerned him before, and my father, who had spent a lifetime observing more than he spoke, had noticed enough to begin making adjustments, not out of suspicion alone, but out of a quiet responsibility to ensure that what he had built would not be misunderstood or mishandled. The documents beneath the letter confirmed what his words suggested, a trust established in my name, separate from the will that Richard had presented so confidently, structured in a way that required my authorization for any meaningful decision, not as a gesture of preference, but as a reflection of who had been present when presence mattered, and as I turned each page, I felt the narrative that had been handed to me begin to loosen, not collapse, but shift, revealing spaces where assumptions had been allowed to stand in place of facts. There was also a note regarding the house, not ownership in the way Richard had claimed, but stewardship, a distinction my father had underlined with quiet precision, explaining that the house was to remain within the trust, not to be sold or transferred without meeting specific conditions that required time, documentation, and above all, my involvement, and I paused there, letting that detail settle, because it was in direct contrast to the certainty with which Richard had spoken, the finality of his tone now revealing itself as something else entirely. Beneath the documents, I found the photograph, a simple one taken years ago, my father seated on the porch with me beside him, both of us looking away from the camera towards something outside the frame, and I remembered that afternoon, not because of anything significant that had happened, but because of the quiet ease of it, the absence of urgency, the way time had felt unmeasured, and I realized that this, more than anything else in the box, was what he had intended to leave me, not just assets or instructions, but a reminder of what had been real, what had been shared without expectation. I closed the box slowly, placing the letter back inside with the same care it had been given, and when I stepped out of the secured room, Linda was waiting near the door, her expression composed but attentive, and she asked if everything was in order, and I nodded, not elaborating, because there was no need to explain what had not yet been spoken aloud, and as I walked back through the bank, past the counters and the quiet exchanges of everyday transactions, I felt a shift that was not dramatic or visible, but steady, like something aligning into place. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, the kind of change that is easy to miss if you are not paying attention, and I stood there for a moment before getting into my car, looking at the envelope once more, not with urgency, but with understanding, because for the first time since the funeral, I was no longer reacting to what had been taken from me, I was beginning to see what had been protected. And that difference, though subtle, carried a weight that did not need to be asserted, it simply existed, waiting for the right moment to be recognized by those who had chosen to overlook it, and as I drove away from the bank, I did not think about confronting Richard or correcting the version of events he had presented, not yet, because some truths are more powerful when they are allowed to unfold in their own time, revealing not only what is real, but who is prepared to face it when it does. The envelope rested on my kitchen table long after I returned from the bank, not as something urgent, but as something that had already done its work, and for the first time in days I did not feel the need to fill the silence with questions, because the answers had begun to take shape on their own, quietly, without needing to be forced into clarity, and I moved through the afternoon with a steadiness that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome, the kind that comes when you realize you are no longer reacting, but choosing when and how to respond. I made a simple dinner that evening, nothing elaborate, just something warm enough to hold the space where routine used to be. And as I sat down at the small table by the window, I noticed how different the room felt compared to the days before, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because the weight I had been carrying without naming it had shifted, redistributed into something I could hold without being overwhelmed by it. I did not call Richard, and I did not return to the house, even though part of me knew I had every reason to do both, because there is a difference between having the right to act and choosing the right moment to do so. And I had learned over the years that timing, more than anything else, determines how truth is received. The next morning, I gathered the documents from the deposit box and placed them neatly into a folder, not for display, but for clarity, and I drove to the office of the attorney my father had mentioned in passing once or twice, a woman named Helen Brooks, whose name appeared more than once in the paperwork I had reviewed, and as I sat in the waiting area, listening to the soft ticking of a clock mounted high on the wall, I felt no urgency, only a quiet readiness to confirm what I already understood. When Helen came out to greet me, she did not ask many questions at first. She simply invited me into her office, closed the door behind us, and gestured for me to sit, and there was something in her manner that suggested she had been expecting this meeting, not in a scheduled sense, but in a way that acknowledged how these things tend to unfold. I handed her the folder, and she opened it with a calm familiarity, scanning the documents with the kind of attention that does not rush but does not hesitate either, and after a few moments, she looked up at me and nodded slightly, as if confirming something that had already been decided long before I walked through her door. She explained that my father had been deliberate in the way he structured his affairs, that the trust he established was designed to operate independently from the will that Richard had presented, and that without my involvement, certain actions could not be completed, no matter how confidently they were announced. And I listened without interruption, not because I did not have questions, but because the answers were aligning with what I had already begun to see for myself. She went on to mention that there had been an inquiry made shortly after my father's passing, someone attempting to access information that was not available to them, and while she did not need to say who, the implication was clear enough, not as an accusation, but as a simple acknowledgement of behavior that had already revealed its own intent. I asked her then, in the same calm tone I had carried into the room, what would happen if someone attempted to move forward without the authority required, and she explained that the process would stall, that transactions would be delayed, that documents would be flagged, and eventually, that the absence of proper authorization would become impossible to ignore. And as she spoke, I realized that what my father had created was not just a safeguard, but a kind of quiet boundary, one that did not need to be enforced through confrontation, because it was already built into the structure itself. When I left her office, the afternoon light had shifted into something softer, and I paused for a moment on the sidewalk, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because the path ahead was no longer uncertain, it was simply unfolding at its own pace. And I understood then that I did not need to rush back into the version of events that had been presented to me. I did not need to correct anyone immediately or reclaim anything through force. Because what was mine had not been lost, it had been set aside, protected in a way that required patience to reveal. That evening, as I returned to my apartment and placed the folder back on the table, I felt a sense of distance from the urgency that had surrounded the funeral, not because it no longer mattered, but because I could now see it more clearly, without the distortion of assumption, and I knew that in time, the difference between what had been claimed and what was actually true would become evident, not through argument, but through the quiet persistence of facts that cannot be rearranged to fit a story that was never complete to begin with. The days that followed did not feel urgent, but they were not still either. They carried a quiet movement beneath the surface, the kind that does not announce itself but changes everything if you are paying attention, and I continued my routine in a way that looked ordinary from the outside, making coffee in the morning, folding laundry in the afternoon, taking short walks when the weather allowed. But each action was accompanied by a growing awareness that something elsewhere was beginning to shift, something that did not need my immediate presence to unfold. It started with a missed call from an unfamiliar number, one that left no message, followed by another later that evening, and then a third the next morning, each one spaced just far enough apart to suggest hesitation rather than persistence, and I let them pass without returning them, not because I did not recognize the pattern, but because I did. And I understood that whatever was trying to reach me had not yet decided how to present itself. A few days later, a letter arrived, forwarded from my father's address, bearing Richard's name in the return corner, and I placed it on the table beside the others without opening it immediately, noticing the difference in weight, in texture, and the way it seemed less certain of its own purpose compared to the documents I had already reviewed, and when I finally unfolded it, the language inside was careful, measured in a way that suggested it had been revised more than once. Phrases about clarifying responsibilities and ensuring everything is handled properly. But between those lines, there was something else, something less structured, a subtle shift from assumption to request that had not been there before. I did not respond, not yet, and instead I continued with the process that had already been set in motion, returning to Helen's office to finalize a few details that required my signature, small things on the surface, confirmations, acknowledgments, nothing that would draw attention on its own, but each one reinforcing the structure my father had put in place, each one quietly affirming what could and could not be done without me. Helen mentioned that certain filings had been delayed, that inquiries had been made more than once regarding timelines and access, and she said it without emphasis, as if it were simply part of the process, but I recognized the pattern in what she did not elaborate on, the increasing frequency of questions that had no immediate answers, the growing realization on the other side that something was not aligning the way it had been expected to. I drove past the house one afternoon without stopping, not out of avoidance, but out of curiosity, and from the street. It looked unchanged, the same white siding, the same narrow porch, the same oak tree, casting its shadow across the yard, but there was a subtle difference in the way it held itself, as if the certainty that had once surrounded it had begun to loosen, and I noticed that the blinds in the front window were partially drawn, something my father had never done, a small detail, but one that suggested a different kind of presence inside. Later that week, another call came, this time with a message, Richard's voice, quieter than I remembered, asking if we could talk things through, saying there might have been some misunderstandings, and I listened to it once, then again, not to analyze the words, but to understand the tone, because tone reveals what language tries to manage, and what I heard was not authority, not certainty, but something closer to recognition, the early stages of realizing that control had never been as complete as it appeared. I did not call back, not because I intended to ignore him, but because I understood that whatever conversation we would have needed to happen at the right moment, not in response to pressure, but in alignment with clarity, and that moment had not yet arrived. Instead, I sat at my table that evening with the folder open in front of me, reviewing the documents once more, not because I doubted them, but because repetition brings a different kind of understanding, one that moves beyond information into something steadier, something that does not shift under scrutiny. And as I traced the lines of my father's handwriting again, I realized that what he had given me was not just a means to correct what had been done, but the space to decide how it would be addressed. On my terms, in my time. Outside, the light faded gradually, the sky moving through its quiet transitions without drawing attention to itself, and I sat there until the room grew dim, not turning on the lamp right away, allowing the shadows to settle into place, because for the first time since everything had begun, I was not waiting for something to happen to me, I was waiting for the right moment to respond, and that difference, though it could not be seen from the outside, was already beginning to change the shape of everything that would come next. By the third week, the silence between Richard's calls had changed, not longer stretches of distance, but shorter, uneven gaps that suggested something was pressing in on him, something he could no longer ignore or manage with the same certainty he had carried at the funeral, and I noticed it not through anything he said directly, but through the way the messages began to shift, less structured, less deliberate. As if the careful language he had relied on before was no longer enough to hold the situation together. One evening, just as the sun dipped low enough to cast long shadows across my living room floor, my phone rang again, and this time I answered, not out of urgency, but because I recognized that the moment I had been waiting for had arrived quietly, without announcement, just as everything else had. There was a pause on the other end before he spoke, longer than usual, and when he did, his voice carried a weight I had not heard before, not just concern, but strain, the kind that builds when expectations begin to unravel faster than they can be repaired, and he asked how I had been, a question so simple it almost felt misplaced, and I responded just as simply, saying I had been. Well, allowing the silence that followed to remain without filling it, he began to explain then, though not in a direct way, mentioning delays, complications, documents that were taking longer than expected. And as he spoke, I could hear the shift beneath his words, the gradual movement from control to uncertainty, and I listened without interrupting, not because I was indifferent, but because I understood that what he was describing was not something I needed to challenge, it was something he was already beginning to recognize for himself. He said there might have been some confusion about how things were arranged, that perhaps we should sit down together to go over everything, and there it was again, that subtle transition from declaration to invitation, from assumption to request, and I noticed how carefully he avoided stating anything directly, how the certainty that had once defined his tone had been replaced with something more tentative, something that left room for acknowledgement without fully committing to it. I told him I would consider meeting, not offering a time, not refusing, simply placing the possibility between us without attaching it to any urgency, and he accepted that without resistance, which in itself said more than anything else he had expressed. Because the man who had once spoken as if decisions were already final was now waiting for permission to continue the conversation. After the call ended, I sat for a while without moving, the phone still in my hand, not replaying the words, but observing the change, because it was not dramatic, not the kind of reversal people imagine when they think of confrontation. It was quieter, more gradual, like watching a structure shift under pressure until it no longer holds the shape it once did. The next morning, I returned to Helen's office for a scheduled review of the trust documents, and she mentioned that there had been additional attempts to initiate transactions tied to the property. Each one halted by the same requirement, the same missing authorization, and she said it in the same calm tone she always used, but there was a clarity in it that did not need emphasis, because the pattern had become consistent enough to speak for itself. She asked if I intended to respond to any of the inquiries that might be directed toward me, and I told her I would, but not immediately, because there is a difference between responding to pressure and responding with purpose, and I had no intention of allowing the pace of someone else's urgency to determine the timing of my decisions. Later that day, as I drove past the house again, I noticed a car in the driveway that I did not recognize, and the front door stood slightly ajar, something that would have unsettled my father deeply, and I parked for a moment at the curb, not stepping out, just observing, because the house no longer felt like something I needed to approach in order to understand. It had become something that would reveal itself through the actions of those inside it. As I pulled away, I realized that the balance had shifted completely. Not in a way that needed to be declared, but in a way that could be felt in every interaction, every delay, every carefully worded message, and for the first time since the day of the funeral, I understood that I was no longer standing outside of what was happening. I was at the center of it, not through confrontation, but through the quiet authority of what had been set in place long before anyone thought to question it, and that realization did not bring satisfaction or resentment. Only a steady sense of alignment, as if everything that had seemed uncertain before was now moving piece by piece toward a clarity that could no longer be avoided. When I finally agreed to meet him, I did not choose a place that belonged to either of us, not the house, not my apartment, but a quiet office at Helen's firm where everything was neutral, where the walls did not carry memory or assumption, and when I arrived that afternoon, I took my seat at the end of the long wooden table without hesitation, placing the folder in front of me with the same care I had shown every time I handled it. Not out of formality, but because I understood the weight of what it contained. Richard arrived a few minutes later, and for the first time since the funeral, I saw him without the structure he had relied on, no crowd, no setting that reinforced his position, just the two of us in a room that required clarity rather than performance, and he paused briefly at the door before stepping inside, as if adjusting to a space where he could not control the narrative before it began. Evelyn followed behind him, her posture still composed, but there was a difference in the way she held herself. A subtle tension in her shoulders that had not been there before, and she took a seat beside him without speaking, her attention shifting between me and the documents on the table as if trying to anticipate what would come next. Helen entered shortly after, closing the door quietly behind her, and she greeted each of us with the same calm professionalism, not acknowledging anything beyond the purpose of the meeting, which in itself set the tone, because there would be no room here for implication or assumption. Only what could be stated and supported. Richard began to speak first, his voice measured but less certain than I remembered, explaining that there had been some unexpected complications, and that he wanted to clear things up, so that everything could move forward, and I listened without interruption, allowing him to finish, because I knew that what he was describing was not the problem, it was the result. When he stopped, I opened the folder and placed the first document on the table, sliding it forward just enough for him to see, not dramatically, not with emphasis. Simply presenting it as it was, and Helen began to explain, outlining the structure of the trust, the requirements for authorization, the conditions attached to the property, and as she spoke, I watched the shift in Richard's expression, not sudden, not exaggerated, but gradual, the kind that happens when recognition replaces assumption. Evelyn leaned slightly forward, her composure tightening as the details became clearer, and she asked a few questions, precise ones, focused on timelines and possibilities, but each answer led back to the same point, that without my involvement, nothing could proceed in the way they had expected, and the certainty that had once defined their position continued to recede. Not because it was being challenged, but because it could no longer sustain itself. I did not raise my voice, I did not remind them of what had been said at the house or at the funeral, because none of that was necessary here. The contrast between what had been claimed and what was now evident spoke for itself, and when there was a pause in the conversation, I placed my father's letter on the table as well, not to prove anything, but to complete the picture, to show that what had been said in place was not accidental, it was intentional, considered, and rooted in a clarity that had anticipated this moment long before it arrived. Richard looked at the letter without reaching for it, his hands resting still on the table, and for a moment, the room held a silence that was not uncomfortable, but definitive, the kind that marks the point where understanding can no longer be deferred. He spoke again then, more quietly, acknowledging that he had not been aware of the full structure, that he had assumed certain things based on what he had seen, and while he did not fully apologize, there was a shift in his tone that carried something close to it, not expressed directly, but present in the way he no longer spoke as if the outcome was already decided. I listened, not for the words themselves, but for the change behind them, and when he finished, I responded simply, saying that what mattered now was not what had been assumed, but what was actually in place, and that any decision moving forward would be made with that understanding, not in reaction to pressure, but in alignment with what had been established. Helen outlined the next steps clearly, explaining what would be required, what could be done, and what would remain unchanged. And as the meeting came to a close, there was no need for further discussion, because everything that needed to be understood had already been presented, not through confrontation, but through clarity, and as I gathered the documents and stood to leave, I did not feel the need to look back or to confirm anything, because the shift that had begun quietly weeks before had now settled into place, not as a victory, but as a restoration of what had always been there, waiting to be recognized in its proper form. The meeting did not end with raised voices or final declarations, it ended the way most things of consequence do, quietly, with an understanding that did not need to be repeated to be real, and as I stepped outside the office building into the late afternoon light, I felt something settle into place inside me, not relief in the way people often describe it, but a kind of steadiness that comes when everything aligns with what you already knew but had not yet seen fully. In the days that followed, the process moved forward without urgency, but with clarity. Documents were filed, authorizations were completed, and the structure my father had created began to function exactly as it was designed to, not through force, but through the quiet consistency of its terms. And I returned to the house not as someone asking to be let in, but as someone who understood that presence no longer required permission. The first time I stepped back through the front door, I paused just inside the entryway. Not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because the space felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had, and I moved through each room slowly, noticing the small details that had once been part of my daily routine, the chair by the window, the worn edge of the kitchen counter, the faint outline where a picture frame had rested for years, and I did not rush to rearrange anything. I simply allowed the house to settle around me again, as it had so many times before. Richard was there when I arrived, standing in the living room with a posture that no longer carried the same certainty, and he did not approach immediately. He waited, as if recognizing that this moment belonged to something larger than either of us, and when he did speak, it was without the tone he had used before, no assumptions, no declarations, only a quiet acknowledgement that things had not unfolded the way he had expected. I listened, not to respond, but to understand the shift that had taken place, because what mattered now was not what had been said in the past, but what could be seen clearly in the present, and I told him, simply, that the structure would remain as it was, that decisions would be made within the framework our father had established, and that nothing needed to be rushed or forced into place. Evelyn was quieter than I had ever seen her, her attention focused on the details rather than the outcome, and while she spoke less, the absence of her earlier confidence said more than anything she could have expressed directly, because it revealed the difference between control and understanding, and how quickly one can dissolve when it is no longer supported by the other. Over time, the house returned to a rhythm that felt familiar, not identical to what it had been, but aligned with it in a way that did not require effort to maintain, and I took on the role my father had entrusted to me without needing to assert it, managing what needed to be managed, preserving what needed to be preserved, and allowing the rest to unfold without interference. Richard adjusted gradually, not through a single moment of realization, but through a series of smaller acknowledgments, each one bringing him closer to an understanding he had not been prepared to accept before. And while we did not speak often about what had happened, there was a difference in the way he moved through the house, in the way he approached decisions, in the way he listened when I spoke, and that difference did not need to be explained to be felt. One evening, as the sun set behind the oak tree in the yard, casting long shadows across the porch, I found myself sitting in the same chair my father had used for years, holding a cup of coffee that had grown cool in my hands, and I thought about everything that had led to this moment, not with regret or resentment, but with a quiet clarity that allowed each part of the story to exist without needing to be changed, because what had been taken was never the whole of what mattered, and what had been protected had revealed itself exactly when it needed to. I did not feel the need to claim anything or to prove anything, because the truth had already done that on its own, and as I sat there, watching the light fade into evening, I realized that what I had regained was not just a house or a set of documents. It was something less visible but more enduring, a sense of place that could not be given or taken by anyone else, only recognized when the time was right, and in that recognition, everything that had once felt uncertain found its way into a quiet and lasting balance.